G'day Art Snackers, my name is James of Burke Creative and welcome to another month of ArtSnacks Box Freestyle, where we take the supplies from the February 2022 ArtSnacks Plus box, experiment with them to within an inch of their lives, and then hopefully create a masterpiece for the hashtag ArtSnacks Challenge. Today's fun fact is I just got a haircut for the first time in 2 years, almost 2 years. Did you notice? And when was your last haircut? Let's get into the box and see what we have to play with today. Here's the February 2022 ArtSnacks Plus box. Here's everything inside. Let's unwrap that little green burrito. Take a closer look at what we'll be playing with today. First up in the Plus box, we have a Hanamool Agave watercolor paper block, 12 sheets, 290 GSM watercolor paper. It's A4 size, that's 8.3 by 11.7 inches. In the Plus box, we also have an ampersand aqua board, sized 8 by 10 inches. We'll be using a Princeton Heritage Brush Series 4050 synthetic sable brush. This is a round and a size 6, as well as 2 Sakura Koi watercolor tubes. I got magenta, number 122, and number 38 ultramarine. As well as my favorite brush pen, it is a Zebra Sensations brush pen. We have our snack and our sticker. Let's get everything set up and have a play first. Like I said earlier, this is one of my personal favorite brush pens. I've been using these for years and years and years. They're a very, very hard-tipped brush pen. They come in a few different sizes. I believe this is the extra fine one. And you can see here, just by varying your pressure when you use the brush pen, you can create such a variety of line width. This is one of the most useful tools for people who like to add a bit of dynamism to their illustrations. Things that are especially good for comic books. Anyone that likes to draw lots of animation style, cartoon style illustrations, these brush pens come in super, super handy, especially for comic books. That's what I'm going to say they're probably the best for, but I just like to use them in anything and everything, just for that line variation. It can be super interesting to add to all types of illustrations. The pen itself is not super duper waterproof once you put it down, but over time it will start to dry. If you do layer it up quite a lot, you can scrub it back to life a little bit. So it's probably something you want to do at the end of your painting or any time you're going to use wet media, just so that you don't risk kind of graying out the colors. But I also don't follow any hard and fast rules when I'm creating. If it doesn't really matter and I want to start with the pen first, I will do that. But yeah, it is one of my absolute favorite all-time brush pens, so I'm glad that's in there for you to try, because I always try to put people on that pen. And I know brush pens can be really intimidating at first. If you've ever used a Pentel brush pen, you know that sometimes they just kind of run away on you, or they can be really hard to control. I think the thing that makes these a little bit different is that the tips are really, really sturdy. They're actually quite firm, and I always say that the shorter and the firmer the brush tip, the easier they are to control. The longer and the softer they are, the kind of harder they are to control. So that's just kind of my own personal thoughts about that. The Koi watercolors, I've never used Koi watercolors before, I don't think, and they were very vibrant, super saturated, as are most when you get them fresh out of the tube. I'd also be interested to let these watercolors dry and reconstitute them and see what happens there, just by the very nature of letting them dry out and adding water to bring them back to life. You do tend to shear them out quite a lot, so it might be interesting, seeing as that is the way that I usually use watercolors, in dried half pans. So this is also something to keep in mind if you're using supplies, that sometimes they can be the exact same supply on the exact same paper, but the way you use it is going to give you a completely different result. So it's just personal preference, really. I don't think one is necessarily better than the other, but you usually find the one that works for you. And for me, the dried half pans seem to be a bit more convenient. I'm doing a lot of watercolor techniques just to get used to the watercolors, but also the paper that they're on. I noticed that the paper was a little bit quick drying. Actually, it might be the watercolor too, I can't really tell, but because it was, I thought, well, it's one of those things that I've known before in the past, that if I ever get a paper towel and put it on kind of damp watercolor, I can usually get the imprint of the paper towel on the watercolor. So you just saw me do that there. I'm just trying a bunch of different mark making techniques as well, even using the little card that comes in the ArtSnacks box, just to get super duper straight watercolor lines. It's actually something incredibly hard to achieve with a paintbrush. That's where you kind of just get a bit experimental, Sometimes when you're limiting your supplies, especially in these ArtSnacks challenges, you've got to think a little bit more outside the box of how you would traditionally use you know, what you've got in front of you, just to achieve different different effects, I should say. Techniques, there are billions, but the effects, you know, there's only a certain amount that we can kind of get out of the supplies before we have to start becoming really creative with it. So you've seen me using my finger to kind of get some finger painting. I did some dry brushing. I also did lots of glazing and seeing how they layered with each other. Lots of water, no water. You know, you just kind of throw it all at the paper. This is a watercolor paper block, which I don't typically use, but I might be a bit converted after this, just for the pure fact that since it's all bound together, it's actually gummed on the sides. It doesn't bend and warp as you play with it, especially for 290 GSM paper. Typically I would use a 300 GSM, so it's not super far off, but it would buckle. With the amount of water that I was throwing at it in some places, it would definitely have started warping, and since it's all gummed around the edges, it keeps nice and flat. So might be something for me to look into in the future. It was also an interesting type of paper. I've never used one of these agave fiber papers before, and there was definitely a bit of a difference to what I'm used to. I'm typically a very student grade watercolor paper lover, like a Canson cold press, that will do me just fine, usually always, but it's interesting to try these different types of papers just for the pure fact that they kind of work differently. I noticed that for what I enjoy in watercolor, and again, this could be the watercolor as well, I don't really know until I've played with them a ton. It didn't have a lot of the blooming, or people call it blooming or pooling or cauliflowering, or when you can kind of push all that pigment around. It didn't tend to do that a lot when I would add fresh water to it. So the texture that I could achieve with the watercolor was just a bit different. Also, when I mixed the pigments together, they did kind of separate a little bit, so they gave me really beautiful kind of secondary results, especially with those purples. Magenta and ultramarine together make beautiful purples, so I'm very excited to get into our final piece and see what we come up with. So we're starting our final piece, and you might have seen the little thumbnail sketch I did earlier. I'm just going to recreate that at a much bigger size. Now, because we only had one of these clay boards, I didn't know how any of this was going to react on here. I didn't know if the techniques would be different, if the mediums would behave differently, because they typically do when you switch substrates, and it was almost like relearning it all over again as I was going. Some of the techniques worked pretty well and kind of, you know, translated, others didn't. What I noticed, especially with these clay boards, and I think it has a lot to do with the fact that there is clay in it, I'm not sure how porous the clay really is, but it sucks up that water. So if you're doing any watercolor straight onto it, you might want to think about doing, like, wetting the clay board first, putting down a clean water I should say, and then adding your watercolor to it. Otherwise, I find that you get a lot more streaking and you kind of like immediate staining if you just go straight onto the dry board. You can see that with that pink circle, it's kind of streaky, the blue one is kind of streaky, but the purple one I put down clean water first and then put my watercolor on top. You can really see the difference there. So that's something that I had to learn as I went. It's something that you can usually get away with on watercolor paper because you can keep scrubbing it. But I just noticed that this surface was super porous. Now, I'm also not using a pencil for this. So luckily I had a thumbnail that I felt pretty happy to work with and was excited to draw, but you can see I'm making short, sharp strokes and nothing is fully defined or really connected too well in this initial stage. And essentially what I'm doing is sketching with the pen first, and then later I will come back in and solidify all those lines. I'm choosing an illustration style that will be really forgiving to this technique. Obviously, if I wasn't doing the challenge and trying to be really rigid with my rules today, I'd probably just use a pencil. But at the end of the day, I do like a good challenge, and I like where this is heading. You might have noticed a while back I did a stream of consciousness art journaling kind of page for ArtSnacks Box Freestyle. Today I'm also doing kind of a stream of consciousness in the sense that when I did the thumbnail, that was a bit of a stream of consciousness. I'm kind of recreating it at this point, but the idea kind of stays the same. And recently I've been working with illustrations that, you know, all kind of connect to each other, but the thoughts don't have to. So the illustrations, I'm kind of going with whatever I feel like drawing, which, let's be real, is always usually a fairy or a mermaid. This one's kind of both. And I went with, you know, just doodling essentially, but keeping it all connected. So it is almost like a whole bunch of my kind of doodling, but it all becomes one image. It's not the most groundbreaking thing in the world, but I have been having a really fun time doing it, just because sometimes the thoughts change halfway through. I'm drawing something and I think, oh, maybe I'll draw this over here, and suddenly, she's got a moon attached to her head. So this is just a fun kind of way to allow myself the freedom to sketch and play and doodle. So I'm not actually trying to create fully finished illustrations, but one will eventuate if I just connect them all together. And what it also does is gives me a really good opportunity to play with all the techniques and do something that I like to call kind of resolving. I mean, not I like to call it, I think most people would call it that, but it's something that I don't think we think about a lot when we're doing illustrations or we're doing paintings or just creating art in general, that what we're actually coming up against a lot of the time is problem solving, like times where we can problem solve something. So something doesn't work, a line doesn't work, or a medium doesn't work the way we wanted it to, or something goes wayward, or there are tons of different problems that kind of come along as you work on a piece. And what I like to work at is finding all these different ways that I can resolve those issues, because ultimately, I think a lot of people get stuck when they keep having these problems arise and they keep having to apply all these different solutions to it. It can actually make people feel like they're doing it all wrong. Now, I believe it's a very natural part of the process that essentially, like, every time we sit down to doing it, we don't think that we're making all these mistakes, but we are having all these moments where we're choosing to either fix something or erase something or clean something up. And ultimately what we're doing is we keep resolving it, we keep refining it, and it keeps going from the initial stage, and we keep, whittling away at it until it gets to the final stage. And so in all that resolve, there's just a ton of different things you can do, and they're not the most difficult things in the world. In fact, they're usually just the simple techniques that we practice, and then they make their way into the piece. Like just doing that kind of soft blend around the eyes. It's just a thing that I felt like doing to add some more color to that little face. Here, glazing, just polka dots on top of an already light blue bow. Here, just practicing brush strokes, and eventually I will layer over everything that's on top of each other. And if you broke all these individual parts down into what is actually happening, they're all incredibly simple processes of technique or, practicing skill. And I like to put all of this in there because this is a way where we get to practice, but we don't actually have to sit down and do that rote learnt style of practicing where you don't have to do a whole page of brush strokes. You can fill in the hair texture and practice your kind of brush control with that brush pen and actually have a finished result from it. So here, when I'm doing these sunray bursts on the face, it's not so much that I want sunray bursts on her face, but I saw an opportunity to add something there, and it's working on that part of my brain that has to resolve how to fit that in, how to keep that spread of sunray bursts kind of even, so it's working on spatial reasoning. As you keep doing it, whether you're thinking about it or not, you are essentially always building on those skills. You're always working at getting better at it. Even if it doesn't feel like that, you could get a result that you're not happy with, but that's why we say it's always important to just do it anyway, because you are getting better at it, even if the result doesn't show that right away. And obviously, the more that you do it, the more practice you have at resolving all of these things and refining it and getting to a process where instead of actually having to think of what you would do, you can have this more intuitive approach to it where you know that you've got all these skills in there and you can just let them pop out as you feel like it. Coming up in this final part, I have the brush pen back in my hand. I've pretty much layered and glazed and patterned everything with the watercolor that I'm happy with. I'm going to use this brush pen to clean everything up, to neaten everything up. So I'll put patterns on things that I think could use a bit of extra detail. If I develop a pattern, say like all the circles have these dotted outlines, I might just repeat that pattern just for the sake of being simple. I like a lot of lines, a lot of cross hatching. You can see that it starts to really clean everything up. What was once a really sketchy, messy, broken line illustration starts to become a lot more refined at kind of, this first glance or, at a distance. Obviously, you can still see some of the lines if you look closely, but using that pressure as I use the brush pen, so really starting to push harder where I want really bold lines, you do start to get away with a lot. You can really make people think that it's a lot cleaner than it was, and that maybe perhaps you did use a pencil sketch in the beginning, which was my intention. I wanted it to look a lot cleaner than it did in the beginning. But I love this part. This part is probably the most meditative for me, or I guess you could say flow-inducing, because it's very simple. A lot of these patterns are just patterns that I work with all the time. There's nothing super significant about them. They're just kind of patterns that sit in my wrists. And a lot of the little details are just really fun to add, and I feel like they really do add a whole bunch of extra character that isn't there beforehand. I could just keep doing this forever, honestly. It's, like I said, the most flow-inducing state. If I really get into it, I could accidentally lose myself for a couple of hours just adding bits and pieces as I go. And the ultimate goal for me was just to kind of clean it all up, and I think you can see how some of those lines, even using the thickness of that brush pen and just going over all the ones that were kind of broken and sketchy, just clean the whole thing up. And I'm very, very happy with my final result. Like I said, completely random, just based off that thumbnail sketch that was just very intuitive, drawing little doodles that I wanted to draw, and they all just have to connect to each other. That's the whole point. So nothing too difficult, and I think you could definitely give it a go. You don't have to challenge yourself to doodle things you would never draw. Just doodle the things that you always draw and smash them all together in one illustration. I hope you enjoyed that video. I hope you enjoyed hearing some of the insights as to how I felt as I went along and some of my thoughts about the process. I'd love to see you have a go. I'm going to join you again for an outro in a second, and until next time, bye. There we go, that's it for ArtSnacks Box Freestyle for February 2022. Thanks for joining me, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you would like to join ArtSnacks, you can use the code James10 at checkout for 10% off. And if you would like to share your work, we'd love to see it using the hashtag ArtSnacksChallenge all over social media and in the Mix community. Until next month, have fun, bye.